Good evening. The music we just heard was recorded on the 7th of February 1954, in case you'd like to know our date. Tonight we start chapter 3, the eternal and the individual and the life divine. We meet some luminous citations from the Vedic and Vedantic tradition here. He opens with one from the Isha Upanishad. He am I, Soham Asmi. The Isha is, of course, a founding plank of the Vedantic philosophy, in which the divine reality is seen as moving deliberately into the universe and putting on the universe as his own habitation, dwells within it, within each being within it. And we come to wisdom when we leave behind the limiting ego and realize that our individuality, part of the whole, is part of that divine. So it is an immense spiritual realization that's recorded in those few verses in the Isha Upanishad, and this is one in which the focus comes back on the truth of the individual as an aspect of that reality. You can't say it's a part, because that infinite is not partitioned. It is a whole. The next, drawn from the Bhagavad Gita in the 15th chapter, a couple of different verses there. It is an eternal portion of me that has become the living being in a world of living beings. Mamai Vamsha, Jiva Bhuttaha Sanatana. A world of living beings, Jiva Loke. The eye of knowledge sees the Lord abiding in the body and enjoying and going forth from it. So again, a conscious divine person that has invested itself, himself, herself, in the reality of the universe, constituting the core essence of every being that dwells in that universe. And it's when awaking to the inner reality that unites all and losing our fixation in what distinguishes each from the other, what divides, that we come to wisdom and then can go forward and enjoy in the world. And this is very much in attunement with the Isha Upanishad. Having renounced, then enjoy. What do you renounce? Not the world. You renounce the ego. You renounce separativity. And then all is part of a large communion. There may be differentiation, as I tend to say in a constant refrain, but there is no division. You might also translate that Sanskrit passage into English from the Gita, whether he departs from or remains, or enjoys according to the gunas. The deluded do not see, only those with the eye of knowledge see. Again, encouragement to move forward and to be yourself out of the bonds of division and live in unity. Then one can properly enjoy the world, all the qualities that it has to offer. Whether you are above in the transcendent or here in the cosmos, You're always in the reality of your own self, which is one with that. And then the last citation, Sri Aurobindo draws from the Rig Veda. It's in the first book, a hymn by Nirgatamas, one of the great seers and rishis. Two birds, beautiful of wing, friends and comrades, cling to a common tree, and one eats the sweet fruit. The other regards him and eats not. Where winged souls cry the discoveries of knowledge over their portion of immortality, there the Lord of all, the guardian of the world, took possession of me, he the wise, me the ignorant. 20th and 21st verse, the first mandala, the 164th hymn. This is very famous, and it recurs in the Upanishadic tradition. It appears in the Mundaka Upanishad, verse 311, and in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, verse 4 to 6. And obviously, it rolls along. I think we have it in the Gita as well. Is it so? And describing the high self and the low self, because really they are not two. But one stands back and regards and supports the other as he enters into the play of time, sits on that tree of cosmos and engages with it and eats the fruit, eats whether it is bitter or sweet. And then eventually, as we see in the Upanishadic tradition, that bird who sits in the lower branch, who is baffled by his constant experience of alternation between the good and the bad, the sweet and the sour, comes to pause for a moment and looks up and sees that other bird, beautiful of wing, and knows, there. So it is us awakening to our own reality when we come to see what we really are. We're no more simply enmeshed in the world, going through the round of experiences. It is not a world of suffering any longer, because we know that at one and the same time, we're ensconced in the universe, and yet above and beyond it. We can hold both poises in the mighty person that we are, because we are part of that. And the Rig Veda hymn goes on here to say, where winged souls cry the discoveries of knowledge over their portion of immortality. In other words, where these souls, figured as birds, come to know what they are, come to discover that they are immortal, then they sing from that new knowledge that they have, that recovered knowledge, that sense of oneness, of immortality, which is native to us. And there, this awakened soul, the rishi, the seer, comes into communion with the one who manifested it all. And he says, that took possession of me. It's not that he climbed to find it. It's that swooped down and claimed possession of the aspiring soul and lifted what was ignorant into knowledge. And that is what we experience, isn't it? We don't conquer the realization of the self. It assumes us. So beautiful selections Sri Aurobindo has chosen for this. They'll resonate throughout our readings over these next several weeks. So let's begin. There is then a fundamental truth of existence, an omnipresent reality, omnipresent above the cosmic manifestation, and in it, and immanent in each individual. So, it is a reference back, of course, to the first book of the Life Divine, which he titled as Omnipresent Reality. So here again, the omnipresent reality, but the omnipresence extends into the transcendence. It's not simply a universal presence. So it is omnipresent above the cosmic manifestation and in it. So in a sense, this cosmos lives in the divine being, and the divine being lives in this cosmos. It is an existence, no? And yet that immanence in the universality dwells in each individual being as well. So it is that which constitutes the truth of the individual, its transcendence and its universality. Because without both, the individual cannot exist. If there were not that existence from which it can be drawn, it simply isn't. And no individual lives exclusive of its connection to all the rest. We are each of us part of the all. So this is the truth of existence, he continues. There is also a dynamic power of this omnipresence, a creative or self-manifesting action of its infinite consciousness force. So by now you realize that he is going through the nature of Satchit Ananda, which is our descriptor for the Supreme. If we can say something about it using language to describe it positively, we can say that it is, we can say that it is conscious, and its consciousness is cognate with its power. So this dynamic power of this omnipresence expresses itself as consciousness force, Chit Shakti. There is, he says, as a phase or movement of the self-manifestation, a descent into an apparent material inconscience, an awakening of the individual out of the inconscience, and an evolution of his being into the spiritual and supramental consciousness and power of the reality, into his own universal and transcendent self and source of existence. So there seems to be a descent, a fall, if you like to put it that way, into an inconscience which is at the basis of materiality. An inconscience, meaning a blanking out of our consciousness. There seems to be no consciousness at all there. This is the chaos before there is even a material universe from which materiality arises. An awakening of the individual out of the inconscience. So, here he describes the beginning of an evolution of this individual which courses through the stadia of the universe as it grows and develops until it eventually recovers its spiritual and ultimately its supramental nature in that power of the reality. And doing so recovers not only the truth of his own existence, but unlocks the key to the universe as well, and finds the transcendent self, which is the source of all. So this is what he's describing here, more than simply an awakening of our subjective existence, our cognitive existence, back into that which we are innately, internally, but this registers as an evolution within nature as well. So that as we become spiritually powerful, we reflect that spiritual power back into nature to reveal its divinity, it grows through the growth of the consciousness in us. It is on this foundation that we have to base our conception of a truth in our terrestrial being and the possibility of a divine life in material nature. There, our chief need is to discover the origin and nature of the ignorance which we see emerging out of the inconscience of matter, or disclosing itself within a body of matter and the nature of the knowledge that has to replace it. To understand, too, the process of nature's self-unfolding and the soul's recovery. So this is the mission we have assigned ourselves, really, and examining it philosophically in these pages which Sri Aurobindo has written. For in fact, he says, the knowledge is there concealed in the ignorance itself. It has rather to be unveiled than acquired. It reveals itself rather than is learned by an inward and upward self-unfolding. Remember, an ignorance implies that which ignores. When you ignore and put away the larger part of yourself to focus on the smaller part, in a sense, when we become married to the idea of being a divided, small case self, when we are the ego, formed by nature, transient, then we're not in possession of what we really are. That ego is temporary. It is a house that is meant to be destroyed and returned to its constituent parts. But what we are is something different from that. And that thing which is hiding in nature can be revealed. It's not that we're going to create it, we're simply going to allow it to release itself into play. And it does this through an inward and upward self-unfolding. So first we go inside to discover what we are, that secret soul, that self behind the self, the true being behind the ego. And then we unfold upwards. We evolve and bring into actual play in the world those involved powers which are secret to the outer consciousness, which we have to discover through the process of evolution. We don't know the riches that are within us. We don't know the knowledge that sleeps in nature, which seems to be ignorant. This we must discover, and it is evolution which is the tool by which we do that, tool and process. To continue. But first, it will be convenient to meet and get out of the way one difficulty that inevitably arises, the difficulty of admitting that even given the immanence of the divine in us, even given our individual consciousness as a vehicle of progressive evolutionary manifestation, the individual is in any sense eternal, or that there can be any persistence of individuality after liberation has been attained by unity and self-knowledge. So two things there. Is this eternity actually present in us? And the second question is that if we're able to establish communion back to that essence, should it be there, does it obliterate anything like individuality into the universality and transcendence of the self? Does that drop enter back into the ocean and disappear? Is there a drop at all? So is it a temporary formation of nature, the soul that we speak about? Does it obtain its reality above phenomena? This we have to discover. Sri Aurobindo continues, this is a difficulty of the logical reason and must be met by a larger and more Catholic enlightening reason. Or if it is a difficulty of spiritual experience, It can only be met by a wider resolving experience. And of course, he suggests here that there is no logical solution to this problem because it requires the solution of a larger and more integrative experience. If you're mired in the experience of the world as a play of duality, then how can you arrive at a unitive experience? And it's going beyond the realm of reason that one can apprehend and merge into that greater self, that larger truth. So he continues, it can indeed be met also by a dialectical battle, a logomachy of the logical mind. But that by itself is an artificial method, often a futile combat in the clouds, and always inconclusive. Logomachy is a word that means a fight over words. Logical reasoning is useful and indispensable in its own field in order to give the mind a certain clearness, precision, and subtlety in dealing with its own ideas and word symbols, so that our perception of the truths which we arrive at by observation and experience, or which physically, psychologically, or spiritually we have seen, may be as little as possible obscured by the confusions of our average human intelligence, its proneness to take appearance for fact, its haste to be misled by partial truth, its exaggerated conclusions, its intellectual and emotional partialities, its incompetent bunglings, and that linking of truth to truth, by which alone we can arrive at a complete knowledge. So he's having us on a bit, those of us who are philosophers dependent on the intellect. It's not that logic has no place, but its role is limited and built up from experience, first of the material world, then of our feeling and emotional development, and then of our intellectual perspicuity as we investigate the world around. And all of that knowledge is useful in its own field. But when you take this knowledge, which would be in the Vedantic terminology, aparavidya, the lower knowledge, it has no application in the field of the higher knowledge, paravidya. We must have a clear, pure, subtle, and flexible mind in order that we may fall as little as possible into that ordinary mental habit of our kind, which turns truth itself into a purveyor of errors. That clarification, the habit of clear logical reasoning culminating in the method of metaphysical dialectics, does help to accomplish, and its part in the preparation of knowledge is therefore very great. But by itself, logic, cannot arrive either at the knowledge of the world or the knowledge of God, much less reconcile the lower and the higher realization. It is much more efficiently a guardian against error than a discoverer of truth, although by deduction from knowledge already acquired, it may happen upon new truths and indicate them for experience or for the higher and larger truth-seeing faculties to confirm. So he suggests again that it is vision and not logic which must guide spiritual philosophy and our approach to truth. Philosophy might, through its step-by-step reasoning, lead us to a conclusion which then our spiritual quest may follow, and find that it was a platform by which we launched ourselves into it. But that kind of logical inquiry is never itself the thing itself. At best, it is a scaffolding. He continues, in the more subtle field of synthetical or unifying knowledge, the logical habit of mind may even become a stumbling block by the very faculty which gives it its peculiar use. For it is so accustomed to making distinctions and dwelling upon distinctions and working by distinctions that it is always a little at sea when distinctions have to be overridden and overpassed. For distinction, we can read that they are functional divisions to the way that our mind approaches things. Our object, then, in considering the difficulties of the normal mind when face to face with the experience of cosmic and transcendental unity by the individual, must be solely to make more clear to ourselves, first, the origin of the difficulties and the escape from them, and by that, what is more important, the real nature of the unity at which we arrive, and of the culmination of the individual when he becomes one with all creatures and dwells in the oneness of the eternal. When all aspects of being converge, then, that is the truth of things to us. That is what we rest with. This is what is finally useful. The first difficulty for the reason is that it has always been accustomed to identify the individual self with the ego, and to think of it as existing only by the limitations and exclusions of the ego. If that were so, then by the transcendence of the ego, the individual would abolish his own existence. Our end would be to disappear and dissolve into some universality of matter, life, mind, or spirit, or else some indeterminate from which our egoistic determinations of individuality have started. So these are the philosophic views from Vedanta and from Buddhism about the nature of the individual self. That when you realize the truth, the individual is going to disappear. When you realize reality as it is, this fictional self, which we call the ego, falls away, and you realize there is nothing there really inhabiting this. Or you realize again that the drop is always part of the ocean. Only the ocean really exists. The drop never really exists. So in transcending the ego, we would abolish it, ourself, or into something that we think is oceanic but may not even be adequately described by that. But what is this strongly separative self-experience that we call ego? It is nothing fundamentally real in itself, but only a practical construction of our consciousness devised to centralize the activities of nature in us. So, it is a reality of Prakriti. The ego is a formation which serves as a temporary dwelling place at best for a Purusha, a conscious person, to reflect upon. But in itself, it is not a spiritual truth. It is simply a construct of nature. And it allows nature, in a sense, to carve an individuality out of a larger surrounding reality. So it seems to exist as a separate being, but it is not. It is always part of a larger being, even as it stands as apparently an individual in a larger nature. we perceive, he writes, a formation of mental, physical, vital experience which distinguishes itself from the rest of being, and that is what we think of as ourselves in nature. This individualization of being in becoming. We then proceed to conceive of ourselves as something which has thus individualized itself and only exists so long as it is individualized, a temporary or at least a temporal becoming. Or else we conceive of ourselves as someone who supports or causes the individualization, an immortal being perhaps, but limited by its individuality. This is, of course, the idea of the Purusha in the Sankhya philosophy. This perception and this conception constitute our ego sense. Normally, we go no farther in our knowledge of our individual existence. So if this is us, then yes. It is a formation of ignorance, and this is not something that lasts. This is not something that we could say is sempiternal, let alone eternal. This is not the individualization which Sri Aurobindo describes. This is not his position. This is not his view of what we are. Let's just be clear about that. But in the end, we have to see that our individualization is only a superficial formation, a practical selection and limited conscious synthesis for the temporary utility of life in a particular body. Or else it is a constantly changing and developing synthesis pursued through successive lives and successive bodies. Behind it, there is a consciousness, a Purusha, who is not determined or limited by his individualization or by this synthesis, but on the contrary, determines, supports, and yet exceeds it. So this conscious person supervises this process of individualization, this drawing together of various constituting elements, material, vital, mental, synthesizing them, but is always beyond it, always exceeds it, while supporting it. The Purusha is the support, the foundation for all the movement of this Prakriti. But it is more than that. Continuing, that which he selects from in order to construct this synthesis is his total experience of the world being. Therefore, our individualization exists by virtue of the world being, but also by virtue of a consciousness which uses the world being for experience of its possibilities of individuality. So, Prakriti is always one, no? So whenever you're dealing with the construction of some aspect of it into a material sheath, which is invaded and possessed by a vital sheath, which is itself invaded and possessed by a mental sheath, all of these sheaths of nature are drawn from that world being. They represent the totality of Prakriti, even though they seem to be writ small in this particular name and form. These two powers, person and his world material, are both necessary for our present experience of individuality. If the Purusha, with his individualizing synthesis of consciousness, were to disappear, to merge, to annul himself in any way, our constructed individuality would cease because the reality that supported it would no longer be in presence. If, on the other hand, the world being were to dissolve, merge, disappear, then also our individualization would cease, for the material of experience by which it effectuates itself would be wanting. We have then to recognize these two terms of our existence, a world being and an individualizing consciousness, which is the cause of all our self-experience and world experience. So Vide, the myth of Shiva and Parvati, of the macro and the microcosmos, of spirit and nature, of Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is always the universal Purusha, really, even when it enters into the aspect of individualizing a self to dwell in a particular name and form of Prakriti, which is itself always drawn from the world being. So this is always the play of Purusha and Prakriti, but they are deeply connected. And of course, his argument will extend farther and make it plain that the individual Purusha is an aspect of that cosmic person as well. We have to get to that point. So let's continue. But we see farther that in the end, this Purusha, this cause and self of our individuality, comes to embrace the whole world and all other beings in a sort of conscious extension of itself, and to perceive itself as one with the world being. In its conscious extension of itself, it exceeds the primary experience and abolishes the barriers of its active self-limitation and individualization. By its perception of its own infinite universality, it goes beyond all consciousness of separative individuality or limited soul being. By that very fact, the individual ceases to be the self-limiting ego. In other words, our false consciousness of existing only by self-limitation, by rigid distinction of ourselves from the rest of being and becoming, is transcended. Our identification of ourselves with our personal and temporal individualization in a particular mind and body is abolished. So by erasing these distinctions, we arrive at this larger truth. We are, in a sense, free from a fundamental ignorance. But is all truth of individuality and individualization abolished? Does the Purusha cease to exist? Or does he become the world Purusha and live intimately in innumerable minds and bodies? We do not find it to be so. He still individualizes, and it is still he who exists and embraces this wider consciousness while he individualizes. But the mind no longer thinks of a limited temporary individualization as all ourselves, but only as a wave of becoming thrown up from the sea of its being, or else a form or center of universality. So this is an experience of oneself as being cosmic in entirety, but standing in a supporting way behind this particular individuality and seeing it as a wave of becoming. No longer living simply in the limited individualization, but being part of cosmicity while sustaining the individual thread. So he says, the soul still makes the world becoming the material for individual experience, but instead of regarding it as something outside and larger than itself on which it has to draw, by which it is affected, with which it has to make accommodations, it is aware of it subjectively as within itself. It embraces both its world material and its individualized experience of spatial and temporal activities in a free and enlarged consciousness. So the Purusha, the sense of the person having grown commensurate with the universe, all of nature's play, in a sense, floats within its being. One experiences the cosmos as being within oneself, identifying with it in that way. And yet, sustaining and maintaining its individual thread, just as the larger Purusha sustains as the world soul the entire cosmos. In this new consciousness, the spiritual individual perceives its true self to be one in being with the transcendence and seated and dwelling within it, and no longer takes its constructed individuality as anything more than a formation for world experience. So it can look at the personalized vehicle constructed by Prakriti from the world being as a tool that it uses for its experience of and expression in the world, and yet regard it rather impersonally, knows that itself is not limited to that figure of self, that it is larger than that. Our unity with the world being is the consciousness of a self, which at one and the same time cosmicizes in the world and individualizes through the individual Purusha. And both in that world being and in this individual being and in all individual beings, it is aware of the same self manifesting and experiencing its various manifestations. So through the process of this growth of inner consciousness, we become yogically one with the world being, with the self expressed as the universe, the cosmic self, as the Atma Shakti expresses itself in the world, and also as the truth behind the individual soul, and they are not different. This goes back to that citation we saw at the beginning from the Isha Upanishad. Soham asmi. He am I. I am that. But all this is also the same thing. And so when one has that realization in which all the walls fall down, and one sees with an unwalled vision that everything is the expression of a single self. It is the Lord, the Isha, which has inhabited all these forms, indeed is the truth of one's own being, and one lives in communion with the all, but in a way that is felt, that goes into sight, liberating our knowledge, but also penetrates, thrilling the aesthetic being, ennobling the physical being. All is charged with this sense of communion, this vast interconnectedness, which is the one. That then is a self, he writes, which must be one in its being, Sat. Otherwise, we could not have this experience of unity. If there were not just the one being, we could never attain unity. There would be division in principle. And yet must be capable, chit tapas, in its very unity of cosmic differentiation and multiple individuality. The unity is its being, yes, but the cosmic differentiation and the multiple individuality are the power of its being, which it is constantly displaying and which it is its delight and the nature of its consciousness to display. Ananda, bliss. If then we arrive at unity with that, if we even become entirely and in every way that being, why should the power of its being be excised? And why at all should we desire or labor to excise it? Casting off the universe then diminishes the scope of real being and reduces its freedom. It does not add to it. It limits it. It confines and restricts and says it can only be the transcendence. It may not become the cosmos. It cannot stand as the truth of all individuals. Why must real being so limit itself? In fact, it does not. We should then only diminish the scope of our unity with it by an exclusive concentration, accepting the divine being, but not accepting our part in the power and consciousness and infinite delight of the divine. It would, in fact, be the individual seeking peace and rest of union in a motionless identity, but rejecting delight and various joy of union in the nature and act and power of the divine existence. That is possible, but there is no necessity to uphold it as the ultimate aim of our being or as our ultimate perfection. And indeed, we cannot subtract the truth from the spiritual traditions that seek an exclusion of self from world. Whether they're going to the highest heaven, whether seeking for moksha or for nirvana, there is a truth in all the paths that lead to that. But it is not the greatest, the most integral spiritual realization possible. It cannot be the ultimate aim of our being, as we are not here accidentally, but we have invested ourselves purposely in this universe. We have an aim which we seek, life after life, without abandoning our immortality. We have put on robes in time and space and have a journey to make. And until we have achieved that destination, we shall not quit. That is our ultimate perfection, that towards which we aim. So, I think this is a good place to pause for the evening. Put our bookmark there and pick it up next week. We are in the month of February, Mother's Month, and perhaps the last couple of Sundays of the month we'll take a pause from our study of the Life Divine and look at Sri Aurobindo's small but mighty book, The Mother, at least in summary form. We'll do that on the 21st and the 28th. Unless we decide to do it on the 14th and the 21st. Stay tuned. We'll make a decision and share it with you. I'm going towards the back of Savitri tonight to Book 10, the Book of the Double Twilight. The canto is the fourth, The Dream Twilight of the Earthly Real. All contraries are aspects of God's face. The many are the innumerable one. The one carries the multitude in his breast. He is the impersonal, inscrutable soul. He is the one infinite person seeing his world. The silence bears the eternal's great dumb seal. His light inspires the eternal word. He is the immobile's deep and deathless hush, its white and signless blank negating calm. Yet stands the Creator Self, the Almighty Lord, and watches his will done by the forms of gods, and the desire that goads half-conscious man, and the reluctant and unseeing night. These wide divine extremes, these inverse powers, are the right and left side of the body of God. Existence, balanced twixt two mighty arms, confronts the mind with unsolved abysms of thought. Darkness below, a fathomless light above, in light are joined but sundered by severing mind. stand face to face, opposite, inseparable, two contraries needed for his great world task, two poles whose currents wake the immense world force. In the stupendous secrecy of his self, above the world brooding with equal wings, he is both in one, beginningless, without end. Transcending both, he enters the Absolute. His being is a mystery beyond mind. His ways bewilder mortal ignorance. The finite in its little sections parked, amazed, credits not God's audacity, who dares to be the unimagined all, and see and act as might one infinite. Against human reason, this is his offense. Being known to be forever unknowable, to be all and yet transcend the mystic whole, absolute to lodge in a relative world of time, eternal and all-knowing to suffer birth, omnipotent to sport with chance and fate, spirit, yet to be matter and the void, illimitable, beyond form or name, to dwell within a body, one and supreme, to be animal and human and divine. A still, deep sea, he laughs in rolling waves. Universal, he is all, transcendent, none. To man's righteousness, this is his cosmic crime. Almighty beyond good and evil to dwell, leaving the good to their fate in a wicked world, and evil to reign in this enormous scene. All opposition seems, and strife and chance, an aimless labor with but scanty sense, to eyes that see a part and miss the whole. The surface men scan, the depths refuse their search. A hybrid mystery challenges the view, or a discouraging, sordid miracle. Yet, in the exact inconscience stark conceit, in the casual error of the world's ignorance, a plan, a hidden intelligence is glimpsed. There is a purpose in each stumble and fall. Nature's most careless lolling is a pose, preparing some forward step, some deep result. Ingenious notes plugged into a motived score, these million discords dot the harmonious theme of the evolution's huge orchestral dance. A truth supreme has forced the world to be. It has wrapped itself in matter as in a shroud of death, a shroud of ignorance. It compelled the suns to burn through silent space, flame signs of its uncomprehended thought in a wide brooding ether's formless muse. It made of knowledge a veiled and struggling light, of being a substance nescient, dense, and dumb, of bliss, the beauty of an insentient world. Sat Chit Ananda. So, until next time, namaste, Jai Ma.